It's great to be here today. I was asked by Darlene to talk about inherent requirements in context, and I took a bit of a liberty by saying I'll do that if I can put it in a broader historical context. So this is, in some ways, my kind of focus, thinking that it's appropriate to really take a big step back and think about inherent requirements from a broad historical perspective, rather than what's happened in the last year or two or kind of 3 years. And I've done that with the kind of title of Masseurs to Mass Participation. And the reason that I've done that is because ostensibly we're here in 2017 talking about inherent requirements, and some of the first references that I can find to inherent requirements are 100 years ago. So it's kind of like a century of inherent requirements, which is maybe a broader stretch than what you might have been thinking about when it came to this event today and where inherent requirements fit in. But nonetheless, it's around about 100 years in which people have been grappling with these issues in professional occupations and tertiary education. The other reason why I think this is really a useful way of being able to think about it is because that 100 years, give or take a couple of years, is neatly bookended within a single occupation or a single profession. So in 1922, the Masseurs Registration Act in Victoria was passed, which regulated that profession, the masseur, and over time that occupation transformed and evolved into physiotherapists. And the first peer-reviewed kind of publication that I've been able to track down around inherent requirements in a profession relates to physiotherapy. So this 100-year kind of period of where we've come from and where we are today is kind of neatly contained within a single professional occupation. And across that time, obviously, things have changed. The kind of medical practice, the physiotherapy practice, the masseur practice has changed significantly, and also the higher education system has changed significantly as well. We've gone from an elite system where very few people engaged in tertiary education to a mass near universal system where pretty much everyone, or almost every second person, is going to be engaged in tertiary education of some kind. Before I get into the sort of nitty-gritty of what's happened over that 100-year period, I first just want to give a bit of higher education systems theory just to be able to provide a lens for being able to make sense of some of the developments, and that I think will... I'll ask you to just keep that in your mind as some of the kind of key themes to be thinking about through the course of the day and through the course of this presentation, to be thinking about some of the key drivers in higher education and how they fit in with an inherent requirements context. So this is what's called the iron triangle, or the triangle of coordination, that was put forward by a renowned higher education scholar, Burton Clark. And in his analysis of higher education systems around the world, he identified three key forces, and they each represent a point of the triangle: the market, the government or the state, and the institution, or in Clark's words, the academic oligarchy. And in Clark's work, you see systems like the Soviet Union or China kind of positioned where the government exerts considerable control over the system. In systems like the United States, the market is a much more potent force in terms of the way that the system works. And in some systems in Europe, particularly Italy, the institutions exert considerable power over the way that the system works. And it's important to recognise that it's not a kind of fixed point. These things kind of shift over time. The balance of these forces shifts and wanes through the course of history. And I thought this was a useful way of being able to understand what some of the forces are in relation to inherent requirements, to be able to give a sense as to what's actually happening here in the system. What's driving this? How does this kind of relate to some of the big forces that shape higher education? I just need to say that this was not designed to be a way of being able to understand inherent requirements, but I'm kind of using this kind of model as a way of being able to understand inherent requirements in broad terms. And before everyone falls asleep with kind of 20 minutes or so of history, I just want to get out there the key message that I want to be sort of talking about today, the core kind of proposition, and that kind of picks up on what kind of Trevor said before about this being a kind of dynamic process. It's a dynamic context. This isn't a fixed process. There's a dynamic relationship between what government is doing in terms of policy around disability and around participation and around the education system. Disability is a feature of the market which has kind of changed over time in various ways. The academic oligarchy kind of changes in the way in terms of how disciplines are regulated and managed and how they see themselves. And universities and education institutions have kind of changed in their role in society and the way that they engage with various requirements in various forms. So now everyone can get your eye patches or something like that, and I'll give you a quick sweep of history. And I've just got a few dates up on screen from 1918 to 2013 that really represent what's happened in the physiotherapy profession or the Masseurs profession over that sort of 100-year, or approximately kind of 100-year time frame. So first off, World War I, that ended in 1918. And one thing that happened in the war was that lots of soldiers were blinded through the kind of battlefield. And what happened as a result of that is they found other things to do. And one of the things that they found to do was to act as masseurs, and they were sort of identified as having particular skills or attributes to be effective in that kind of process. And we have here on screen a little quote from the British Medical Journal from 1922 saying that soldiers blinded in the war, trained in massage, remedial gymnastics and medical electricity were accredited as kind of blind masseurs. So perhaps think about that next time you see a physio as to whether or not you're being subject to remedial gymnastics or some other kind of highfalutin kind of activity. So in that context, blindness is a feature of the market. The market for students entering the occupation and the market itself in terms of the labour market involves a significant number of people with a particular disability-related characteristic. And what we see in a couple of years post-World War I ending is that the masseur profession begins to be regulated. And in 1922 in Victoria, the Masseurs Registration Act was established. And within the Act, the powers of the board included the power to hold examinations, including special examinations for blind students. So this kind of market feature is enshrined in the legislation as something that needs to be accommodated within the kind of occupation and the work of the board. When I came across this, I thought it was a kind of interesting feature of Australian history and Victorian history, but I sort of wondered, was this some kind of quirk of history? Did it actually relate in any way into the actual activities of the board? So what I've done in the last couple of weeks is go to the State Records Office and look at the minutes of the board from the early years. And what I found as part of that process is really multiple references to these issues, and a board that was really grappling quite intensely with these issues as well. So, for example, in 3rd of April 1925, literature from London and an education institution that was providing specific training to blind students in the occupational profession of the masseur was circulated to all members of the board. If you put that in the current context, to what extent would you see that members of the medical profession or the education profession or other professions would be at a board level actively involved in looking at the curriculum structures for particular disability groups? In some cases yes, some cases no. But it's kind of interesting to juxtapose what happened then and what's happening now in that process. In addition to that, the inaugural chair of the board, Dr. Springthorpe, went on a year-long study tour of Europe, and the primary focus of his activity was to look at training methods for the blind in the UK. So the chairman of the board going out, sort of examining this, reporting back to the board in Melbourne, and a hearty vote of thanks was recorded in the minutes. Just kind of fascinating little details of history from my perspective. If we kind of fast forward a little bit between 1922 and 1978, obviously those blinded in the war, the war ended, so the kind of new entrance to the kind of blind community, the dynamics of that kind of shifted in some ways. So the market is going to be evolving in some ways in terms of the kind of characteristics of that community. But through that time frame, as the Masseurs Registration Act was amended in various ways, the provisions for special exams for blind students were retained. So that's kind of there as a consistent feature through that subsequent time period. But the other kind of interesting feature across that time frame is that in the very first edition of the Australian Physiotherapy Journal, which is kind of 1955, there was an article by someone affirming the legitimacy of physiotherapy as an occupation for blind students. And that says a couple of things to me. One is that it kind of represents a shift in the way in which the profession is seeing itself. It's moving from a masseur to a physiotherapist kind of role. There's an increasing technical specification sort of going on there, and sort of advocates are still claiming or asserting the rights of particular individuals and characteristics to be part of that occupational profession. Kind of interesting in some ways. However, once that sort of process is complete in terms of the transition from masseur to physiotherapists and the establishment of the Physiotherapist Act in 1978, we no longer see any reference to special exams or to blind students. So in some ways the market has shifted, the occupation has shifted, and this detailed investigation of how blind students might be taught as physiotherapists or masseurs is now no longer part of the way in which that profession sees itself. Moving forward a little bit to 1990, what we see with the kind of Dawkins reforms and the kind of transformation of Australian tertiary education was that all of the colleges of advanced education were sort of integrated into universities, and universities then started to play a role in the training of particular occupations. So all of a sudden the kind of locus of control has shifted from the registration board and some of the training colleges and the hospital training settings to a university context, and we start to see a kind of relationship between university and the kind of occupation in some ways. And again, another little kind of quirk of history, about 1923 the University of Melbourne first wrote to the Masseurs Registration Board to say, yeah, come to us, we'll do the training for you, we're Melbourne University, come work with us. And that triggered quite a fierce and emotive response from the Masseurs Association saying, we don't want to have any part of a university whatsoever. But by 1990, the university had its way, and it began to train physiotherapists within the University of Melbourne context. At my university, La Trobe University, it merged with Lincoln Health Sciences Institute, which was where physiotherapists were trained up until that point. And even today there are members of staff of La Trobe University that see themselves as Lincoln staff rather than La Trobe staff. These kind of cultural artefacts have a kind of can be very, very sticky in some ways. Fast forward a little bit more to 2013, so I'm going to try and get this name right, but forgive me if I do not. But Bielikowski, 2013, building on the work of Amanda Johnson and Trevor, etc., published an account of the development of inherent requirements in physiotherapy, talking about the rationale, the logic, the process, the key features of it. So in a kind of 100-year sweep, we've gone from a market with significant kind of features around kind of blindness, establishment of the occupation, its continued refinement and specialisation, integration in the university context, and as participation grows and numbers grow, seeing the inherent requirements kind of emerge as a way of being able to deal with these kind of issues in general terms. Now, I can read everyone's mind here, and I can see everyone's starting to nod off and saying that's all well and good, thinking about this topic of inherent requirements in physiotherapy from 100 years ago, but what's it got to do with today's kind of current practice and current policy development? So I just want to say I hear you've indulged me in my kind of sweep of history, so I'm now going to talk about more recent developments and policy changes that relate to inherent requirements. And I think if one is going to do that, one needs to start at the origins of the contemporary higher education system. So the unified national system that we have today, where almost all higher education delivery is done through universities, has its origins with the Dawkins reforms of the late 80s and early 90s. And through that process, it was recognised that as the economy was to be opened up to competition, and lots of workers were likely to be displaced from that kind of process. We needed a better system of being able to upskill the population and do that in a fair and equitable manner. And A Fair Chance for All was the kind of landmark policy document that supported or enabled that that adjustment of the education system to a much more fairer system. And A Fair Chance for All establishes disability as an equity group for in some ways the first time. And at other presentations, I've kind of posed the question about what might have happened with disability had that group not found its way into the list of priority groups, as the Vice-Chancellors at the time advocated for its exclusion from the equity groups that were listed in A Fair Chance for All. So we're very lucky that it did form part of that group, and that has set a kind of path dependency for subsequent developments in disability in higher education in subsequent years. 1992, the DDA is introduced, and that's in some ways part of that broad set of policy changes that were about making Australia a fairer place. And it's great to have the Disability Commissioner here today, and without the DDA, we would not have such a position. And in some ways, it's kind of fantastic that as a beneficiary of a more inclusive education system, that we have a Disability Commissioner who is deaf. I just think it's a kind of fantastic achievement of the Australian society and Australian education system to have that as an outcome of the system overall. But with the DDA, what it does at its heart is make direct and indirect discrimination unlawful, and positions reasonable adjustment as the mechanism of being able to mediate the practice in universities around risks around sort of discrimination. Fast forwarding to 94, the equity performance indicators are introduced, and this is a direct kind of consequence of A Fair Chance for All. It recognised that we couldn't monitor progress on the participation of various equity groups if we didn't measure their participation in a systematic way. So for the first time in 94, we start to collect disability information systematically in higher education, and that enables us to chart the growth in student numbers in ways that we couldn't do previously. Fast forward to 2000. So what we have is 6 years since the Martin indicators of data collection on increasing participation and increasing challenges faced by universities in being able to provide reasonable adjustments and work through the process of providing reasonable adjustments. And in response to that, Watts and Stickles and others developed a set of guidelines setting a conceptual framework for how to think about inherent requirements and how to integrate that within kind of university settings. And I think one of the interesting things about this for me is that the work emerges from Curtin University, and the last time I checked, Curtin University still does not have a coherent approach to inherent requirements, and it kind of highlights the political challenges of being able to move forward with inherent requirements within an institutional sort of context. So the kind of landmark study that set up the framework has been used by other institutions in the sector, but it's not been used effectively within the Curtin environment itself. Fast forward to 2004. So the Disability Standards for Education and changes to the Disability Discrimination Act come in, which really kind of lift the bar in terms of the expectations of education providers around the provision of reasonable adjustments and developing curriculum that is inclusive, etc. So we start to see, I think, from there some universities starting to take this issue much more seriously than what they perhaps might have pre the education standards coming into force. And in 2008, and this is in some ways where my role in this sort of process reaches its zenith, had worked with the Watts and Stickles document to consider in the University of Melbourne context what our approach would be to inherent requirements. And the approach that we took at the time was to set up within the university's handbook a template field that allowed courses and programs to specify the inherent requirements of their particular programs. And I think what we see from that point on is some courses starting to take that issue, engage with that issue, and develop their own requirements. But if I'm to be really blunt about this, and I would have to say that some courses took it more seriously than others, and some individuals were more competent than others in being able to kind of translate those kind of processes. So I think there's a lesson from that in some ways, that if you just leave it all to the disciplines and the academics to just do it by themselves, you'll get variable outcomes in some ways. 2010, and I think kind of hats off to Trevor and Amanda and others that are involved in that process. They really kind of set the benchmark for how to go about developing inherent requirements through the Inherent Requirements of Nursing Education project. So this is the project that stimulated the work in physiotherapy, which was kind of referenced earlier. And it's also been emulated by so many other institutions in the sector. So this is, in some ways, the cookie cutter that's been used and kind of transplanted in various institutions across the sector. And in recognition of the proliferation of inherent requirement statements, myself and colleagues at La Trobe conducted a study funded through the National Centre for Student Equity in Higher Education that did an audit of inherent requirement statements. And I think the work that was done was in 2015, so we kind of set a line in the sand and said, on this date, what's the makeup of the sector in terms of inherent requirements? And we acknowledged through that process that this is a fast-moving space, and I think already this work is in part redundant. The number of courses that have changed the way that they do it, the number of institutions that have started to adopt it, the number of disciplines that have started to adopt inherent requirement statements has kind of changed quite rapidly. So it's in some ways nearly time for another audit or another assessment of where things are at to examine the current state of play for inherent requirements in Australian higher education. In terms of the key findings of the report, I think there are three things that are worth kind of surfacing, and I imagine some people have read the report in the room. One is just a recognition of the extent to which these statements are proliferating. The second is the extent of variability across the system and within universities in terms of how they go about developing and publishing inherent requirement statements, and also just a recognition of the level of transfer across disciplines and across institutions, and really the statement that is really kind of can be seen as the catalyst for everything is the Iron project. So that's a kind of a very kind of rapid sweep through what's happened with a single profession and what's happened in higher education in terms of inherent requirements. But I want to try and kind of pull that together in some ways and get a sense as to what do we understand about that in terms of the triangle of coordination, and how might that inform subsequent developments. And really today's forum kind of marks an opportunity for everyone to be thinking about these things in a much more detailed and much more sophisticated way. And already from the kind of opening kind of session, it's clear that the level of maturity around thinking about inherent requirements is orders of magnitude higher than what it would have been in 2010 when Trevor and Amanda were doing their work, and 2008 when I was doing mine, and 2000 when Cheryl Stickles and others were doing their work. So I think it's worthwhile just looking at this from the position of the Masseurs / physiotherapy kind of profession model, and just looking at the four key themes that are kind of exposed in that triangle of coordination. So from a government perspective, governments can play a role in setting up an accessible profession, as they did in 1922. They can support and enable growth and participation in ways that are more or less inclusive of people with disabilities. They have supported the transition of particular occupations into the higher education system, as they have with physio. And they set standards for inclusion through Disability Discrimination Act, Disability Standards for Education, etc. If one thinks about the market for and how that kind of relates to inherent requirements, in the 1920s we have a big market of kind of blind students and blind professionals. It's a kind of key accepted kind of feature of the market that starts to reduce across time for a whole range of reasons relating to social world events, etc. And a reduced role for the blind and people with disabilities within that particular occupation. In the 90s, however, we start to see a recognition that maybe things have gone too far and we need to set new parameters around the level of inclusion-exclusion in society. And by the 2000s, we see a kind of massive explosion in participation in higher education, which starts to put pressure on a whole bunch of systems to be able to be more inclusive of this growing numbers of students in the system. And along those lines, depending on what you count and measure, the current higher education data collection has around about 60,000 students with disabilities in the system. The Survey of Disability, Ageing and Carers through the ABS has got about 100,000 students in the system. And depending on how you slice and dice the numbers, you can come up with a lower or larger figure. But by any stretch of the imagination, 100,000 students that are entitled to some form of adjustment by virtue of their disability imposes some significant challenges in terms of how do we work through that process efficiently? How do we work through that process in a fair and equitable manner? In terms of academic conventions, in the 20s, Masseurs was really just a kind of emerging profession trying to set its boundaries, and looking at the early minutes of the registration board, it's kind of fascinating to see how they worked through whether or not chiropractors were on equivalent footing to masseurs, or whether osteopaths were the same or different. And we see today that these are very discrete professions rather than integrated kind of profession. But the origins of that go back to these early decisions of the board. Through to the 70s, we see an occupation that's becoming much more specialised, much more scientific in the way that it goes about things. And that has some implications for who can be involved in that profession in some ways. We see in the 90s a transition to an academic university context that imposes kind of new challenges for the occupation in terms of how it self-regulates and how it engages with the training dimensions of a university setting. And by today, physiotherapy is one of the highest status professions within a university context, very, very high barriers to entry. So it's very, very much kind of entrenched now after that kind of transition period. In terms of institutional control, and particularly around inherent requirements, in the 20s, it's the board. The board is making case-by-case decisions, and they can do that because there's really only a handful of students that are involved in the process. By the 70s, some of these things are being done within a training context, perhaps mediated by what's happening in a clinical context as well. But through the 90s and 2000s, this then becomes part of a university-mediated response where academics and disability practitioners and students are negotiating reasonable adjustments with, in some cases, an inherent requirements reference point, and through the prism of the DDA and disability standards for education. Just to kind of wrap that up in a kind of diagram, and this is the final slide, and there may well be some sort of questions afterwards. I think it's worthwhile thinking about what might this kind of triangle of coordination tell us about what's happening with inherent requirements and what we might do to kind of strengthen their role in the system, or to challenge or interrogate their presence in the system. So first, from a kind of government perspective, I think it's fair to say that government is at best neutral about inherent requirements. The disability standards for education talk about upholding course requirements, but are fairly neutral in the way that universities might go about that. The higher education standards are also make reference to learning outcomes, but are fairly neutral in the way that can be done by universities. So there's kind of an institutional choice there as to how to go about that. And I think it's also worth saying from a government perspective that despite there being 100,000 students in the system, or 60,000, depending on how you count it, government funding for disability is trivial at best. 0.03% of university revenue is associated with additional funding for disability. So I think there's a kind of question to be asked there around what government's role might be with this. From a market perspective, disability is obviously a really important market segment now, taking up a larger and larger proportion of enrolments in the system, and these students are increasingly coming into the system with an expectation that they have a right to an adjustment and that they have a right to be able to access the course of their of interest and their choosing and aptitude. So we have a kind of neutral state and a kind of market that's shifting, and really the kind of locus now is kind of shifting to the institution in terms of what they will do about kind of mediating this market demand. And the way they've gone about that is in some cases to develop inherent requirement statements. So it's present in some disciplines, in some institutions, but not all. So there's obviously a choice that's being made there. In terms of its use, there are a couple of ways of understanding the way in which they've been constructed. One is as a way of being able to inform choice, to say you must be able to do these things or have these attributes to be able to participate in this program, enabling kind of students to self-select in and out of particular programs. We also see, in terms of the way in which these statements are framed, some variation in the way that they're constructed. In some cases, they're talking about the tasks. You must be able to do this thing. This is critical to the course. In other cases, it's you must have these attributes. You must have emotional stability or some other level of kind of personal task, individual task. So the locus of control in the triangle is kind of shifting towards the institutional sort of setting, but it's not fixed in stone. And I think it's worthwhile just in closing to recognise that where we meet today is the Emily McPherson building, kind of representing kind of women's education in some ways. And the way in which society is constructed and thought about what is a fitting profession for a man or a woman has kind of shifted considerably since the time this institution was established. And now it's perfectly okay for women to do a whole range of things that were previously thought of as out of the question. I think the same may well apply to disability, and part of the challenge for you today is to be thinking about how to kind of take that forward, recognising that it's not set in stone and that it is a dynamic context. And on that note, over to you for any questions.